To start the interview training, let's get an overview of the ESOP interview. The questions are open-ended. That is, the questions cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. The ESOP questions ask the client to share a very personal part of their life, their religious and spiritual beliefs, behaviors, practices, and even conflicts. The questions have been field tested by me for over 30 years in multiple clinical settings, from inpatient to private practice, and the ESOP has been taught to clinical staff at many county mental health programs in California and at professional conferences. The ESOP interview is evidence-based. Each letter in the ESOP stands for one of the 5 areas of religious and spiritual functioning that research has shown to affect clinical outcomes. Specifically, in order: screening, strengths, organized, personal, and problems. These terms are drawn from the academic and scientific literature. As a mental health professional, it is important to be knowledgeable about academic and scientific terminology to prepare and write your treatment plans. However, clients may use terminology differently than used in the ESOP. For example, a client may use the term spiritual to describe their participation in a church. However, in the ESOP, spiritual specifically refers to a personal, private practice. Attendance at a church or temple would be considered an organized form of religion in the ESOP. But when a client uses a specific term to describe their religious or spiritual beliefs and practices, go ahead and use their term in the interview, even though the ESOP would use different terminology drawn from the literature. Doing so demonstrates to the client that you really are listening to them rather than administering a checklist of preset questions. The ESOP assessment relies on your skills as an interviewer to create the high level of therapeutic rapport necessary to elicit such personal information from a client. The next lessons will drill down on each of these 5 topic areas, including both the supporting research and specific questions that can be used to elicit a client's religious and spiritual beliefs and practices. But first, the overview. The first S in the ESOP interview stands for screening. The interview starts with screening questions that are quite general, such as, do you have any beliefs or practices that help you cope with difficulties or stress? This kind of question allows the client to start sharing about their religious and spiritual beliefs by using their own terms to describe their beliefs and practices, or lack of them, before being asked about their participation in a church or temple or other specific areas of religious and spiritual functioning. While most Americans identify with a specific religion, a 2015 Pew Research Center survey found 23% of the American population view themselves as atheists, non-believers, or secular humanists. Clients who hold such views may not use religious or spiritual language. That is why it is important not to automatically use Judeo-Christian or other religion-specific words like God, prayer, or church in this initial screening. Imposing such terms that are outside their beliefs or are irrelevant could interfere with building a therapeutic alliance. Ideally, use the words clients provide in their screening responses. Sometimes a more general term, such as meaningful, sacred, spiritual community, spiritual practices, spiritual literature, or higher power, can be used with people who do not use religious terminology to describe their core beliefs and practices. Conducting a spiritual assessment may not be appropriate with someone who does not use spiritual language to describe their beliefs and experiences. This is the rationale for using screening questions to determine the relevance and appropriateness of conducting a full spiritual assessment. However, among clients who self-identify as atheists, agnostic, secular humanists, or just uninterested in religion or spirituality, the clinician can often continue the interview substituting the words the client uses in response to this opening question. For example, if the client says nature, humanity, or the mystery is a source of hope and strength, the clinician should use these words in the remainder of the interview. The second S stands for religious and spiritual strengths. Surveys show that for most Americans, their spirituality is experienced as a source of strength, and clients can often identify specific ways they use their spirituality to support their recovery. Once identified, such strengths can be incorporated in treatment planning as a resource for the client. Some of the strengths identified by the client may involve participation in an organized form of religion or spirituality, which would be associated with the next letter in the ESOP assessment interview. Some strengths may represent a personal practice. These too are also covered as part of the ESOP. The O stands for participation in organized forms of religion and spirituality. This includes membership in religious organizations such as temples, mosques, and churches. Also, in the ESOP, participation in a book club, a yoga class, or a gardening group that meets regularly could also be considered as participating in an organized form of religion or spirituality. Participation in organized forms of religion and spirituality is associated with many positive health outcomes. It can provide social support as well as modeling positive religious coping responses for loss and many other problems. The first P stands for personal religion and spirituality. Many clients are actively involved in religious and spiritual practices that they do on their own, although sometimes they may do these same practices in classes and other group settings. These personal practices can support a client's recovery by reducing stress and promoting a positive sense of self and hope. Examples include someone who takes walks in a park during their lunch break, prays at night before going to sleep, or practices yoga in the morning at home. Even having a pet or working in a garden can provide these benefits. The last P stands for religious and spiritual problems. While people often use religious and spiritual coping to positively support themselves, some forms of coping are associated with distress and struggle, which can become a problem requiring clinical attention. Clients may have interpersonal conflicts with people in their religious group or with religious leaders. They may disagree with some of the beliefs that are part of the religious group. And some experience a loss of faith as an additional complicating stressor that interferes with accessing their spiritual strengths and resources. This overview outlines the structure and flow of the ESOP interview. For 6 years as a member of the faculty at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, I taught diagnostic and other kinds of research interviews which require the use of specific questions in a specific order. However, the ESOP is a clinical interview, not a research interview. Therefore, you should feel free to ask questions in any order. For example, if during the screening question a client mentions that they attend a church, then you could skip to the ESOP questions on organized forms of religion and spirituality. However, in learning a new interview, you'll probably want to ask the questions in the standard order the first few times. Also, when you can, incorporate their prior answers into these questions. For example, if the client already answered that meditation is important in their life, then in formulating your questions, you wouldn't ask if they have a personal spiritual practice. Instead, you could ask for an example of a time when their meditation practice helped them with their mental or emotional well-being. Now let's look in more detail at these 5 areas in the ESOP interview and the questions used to elicit clinically relevant information about religion and spirituality.